Sarah Grynberg, welcome to Straight Talk.
Mark Forrest, thank you so much for having me.
How's it feel like being on the other side of the mic?
Oh, I love it.
Yeah? You love it, really?
I love it.
You don't get a bit weird? You want to start asking questions?
Yes, I do, because that's obviously naturally what I do. But at the same time, it is nice to be able to talk and give more of my opinions as well. I love telling my story too. So, this feels very normal to me with the microphone and all of the setup.
Yeah, well, it's funny. I get quite, I don't feel comfortable on the other side.
Really?
Yeah, no. I don't.
How come? I would never have thought that of you.
I don't really like talking about what I've done and stuff like that. It just doesn't interest me. I'm more interested in having a guest so I can find out what their deal is.
Yes.
I'm not interested in myself. Yeah, it's funny. I have a view on conversation.
Yeah.
Which is what podcasts are. But I have a view on conversation. I think conversation generally, especially if you're speaking to an audience, a live audience, it's the person who's doing the talking is actually having a conversation with themselves.
Mm.
So when I'm talking to you now, I'm actually having a conversation with myself about what I want to know about you, about Sarah.
Yes.
If I'm doing the talking, you're asking me a question, I'm now having a conversation about myself, and I find that myself really boring. Because I know about it. I'm not learning anything. I'm not finding anything out about myself, but I find it really boring. So for me, conversations are not two-way. I find all conversations, my theory is that all conversations are one way, but they somehow blend. So I'm talking about what I'm talking about, whereas right now I'm talking about my own thoughts, and you're talking about what your thoughts are. Sometimes the audience is listening to them. They're trying to put them together all the time. The audience is trying to put it together for us all the time. But really, everything we talk about is what's going on in my own head.
That's so interesting. I do think a really good interviewer will ask you questions that make you think, though. And so then you might go back in your mind and either maybe to many years ago or to something that you've never contemplated before. And then you discuss that and you feel really good about it, hopefully. And then it kind of is something new.
Yeah, you realise something about yourself.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, a good interviewer, though.
I think the reason why I say that is because people want to talk to me about what happened 20 years ago, like back in the Wizard days and all sort of stuff.
Yeah.
And I've told that story so many times that I just find it incredibly boring. Just for me, that's all. It's just a personal thing. I'm probably being selfish, but personal thing. And I'm so selfish that I actually want to learn about everybody else. I want to know what their deal is.
Yeah.
And speaking of that, so you were the executive producer of the Hamish and Andy show.
I was.
That's
for
like
4
the
years.
biggest podcast in the country.
And has been since it started, and I started with it. So
what year was that?
Oh my goodness, that's a good question. It was 6.5 years ago, about 7 years ago now, that I moved into podcasting. And when I moved into podcasting, they said to me, when they were trying to get me to move over to that department, they said, look, no one knows this, but Hamish and Andy are about to finish up on radio and we would love you to be their executive producer. And, if anyone gets offered that job, it's like the best thing in the world.
Gold.
So I, as a producer, couldn't believe that I was getting offered this role and took it in a second. But the funniest bit was 7 years ago, podcasting wasn't that big. And I kind of was like, podcasting. And I'd only listened to Serial. I don't know if you remember that podcast, but it was like one of the only decent ones back in the day. And then I moved over to podcasting. I started with The Boys, which,
This is podcast one.
This is podcast one.
Yeah.
You were there at podcast one.
I was the first. They got me to change my podcast name to The Mentor. So it used to be called The Mark Boris Show.
Yeah.
So I got a call from, what was the guy's name? The guy.
Grant Tottiel?
Tots.
Oh, no.
Todders. Yeah, Todders.
Yeah, Todders.
Yeah. He said, we'd like to do your podcast and this is the business model, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
And in those days, prior to that, we used to do our podcast up here in King's Cross on top of underneath the Coca-Cola sign. And we did all ourselves. But and he offered me a good deal, so I thought I'd do it. And that was to launch Podcast One, which is a platform.
Yes.
Which is has become Listener. It's a different platform, but it has become Listener.
Yeah.
And Hamish and Andy were equal. We all started around at the same time.
Yeah, that's exactly correct.
6-7 years ago?
It was 7 years ago.
Yeah.
And then 3 months into me producing Hamish and Andy, because I'd had my own experiences of burnout and a few other things, and I'd really gotten into personal development work and the idea of mindset, I said to Grant Tothill, who I had worked with for years, hey, I've got this idea for a podcast. And I told him the idea and I put together a plan because, I knew how to do all that because I had done so many years of producing. And he said, just give it a go, but you'll have to produce it yourself for the time being. And I did. And it's funny how things work. I'm not sure if you would know this guy, but he's huge in the personal development world. The first person that I had on my podcast, A Life of Greatness, was Joe Dispenza.
Yeah, I know. I don't know him, but I know who he is.
Yeah, who's massive. So, what a great get for the first person to have on your podcast. I don't know if you were like this because you've had a lot of experience in TV and all that kind of stuff, but I'll never forget he was doing a show in Melbourne. He'd come from the States and I had gone down with my audio producer and we had 20 minutes during the break for an interview. I mean, I would never do a 20-minute interview now. I was so nervous. The first time, you do something like that, I was so nervous and we did it so well. And I still can't believe that was the first interview I ever did when he is one of the biggest names in personal development. And the podcast took off from there.
It's just prior to that, though, you said you were an executive producer or producer. Were you producing a radio show? Or?
I was producing radio.
Yeah, for the Southern Cross Austereo group?
Yes. So this was an interesting thing. I had worked for them for years, Fox, Triple M, Southern Cross Austereo. I had worked in corporate before and then I always wanted to work in media and I got the role when I was, I think it was 14 years ago. And I started doing activations on all these kind of things. And I really wanted to do producing and I really wanted to understand how that world worked because—
Can you explain to our audience what is a producer?
Yeah, great question. So a producer basically is someone who puts the show together. For example, for a podcast, it could be getting the guests, editing the podcast before it then goes to an audio editor, doing a first edit on it. It'd be everything from booking studios to organising lighting to making sure that everything runs efficiently. And it's kind of a lot of admin is required for that, but a lot of personal skills are required for that because you're dealing with talent. Majority of the time, you need to be able to deal with any of the talent's requests or demands and make sure that they're in a situation when they do either their radio show or the podcast that they feel that they're taken care of, right? So it's actually quite high pressure, but if you're working with great people, it can be absolutely so fun and vibrant. And so this is what I wanted to do. And so I was doing my day job of activations and things at the radio show. And I had said, I really want to try out producing. And they're like, all right, well, you sit with the hot breakfast. This is back in the day with Eddie Maguire and Luke Darcy. And they had Jay Mueller as their EP who, for anyone that doesn't know Jay, which is probably the majority of people listening, he is the best producer, one of the best in the country. So I, unpaid, woke up at 4:30 in the morning, sat with them, watched some of the Australia's best producers do their thing. And then I would also, unpaid, stay later and then sit with other producers at nighttime for the nighttime shows and watch them. And I loved it. I absolutely loved it. And I asked good questions. That's what they told me. And after a while, Dave Cameron, who at the time was, I think, the general manager of Austereo, said, we've got a producing role if you want to take it. And I thought, okay, great. And again, I was working on weekends doing the weekend breakfast show. And so I was working Monday to Friday and then Saturday doing the show. But I loved it so much. And, sometimes you have to put in the hard yards when you're young to get to where you want to go. And then we got the tap on the shoulder. I was doing a show on the weekend that they wanted this show to be the breakfast show of Sydney. But the talent were in Melbourne, and this was the first time that they were going to broadcast to Sydney from Melbourne. So the producers and a lot of the team were in Sydney, but then I was in Melbourne with the talent and the digital producer and, an assistant. And I don't know if you know much about breakfast radio, but it is grueling, absolutely grueling. And at the time, I had a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old. And I was waking up at 3:30 a.m. 5 days a week. And it was hard, and it was long hours and very hard with young kids. And it's a kind of job where you never turn off. It's not like if something big happens that you can just miss it. You need to be on top of the news. You need to be on top of what's happening in sport, in entertainment. And it was just really full on. And I got really sick and ended up just having this moment where I was so burnt out and so unhappy. And with all that came the fact that I'd never done any inner work on myself. It was all about trying to achieve these great things, this big producing role. I was getting paid more money than I ever had at the time. And it ended up in me getting unbelievably unwell and just really like what they call a dark night of the soul, looking at my life and kind of saying, how did it become so empty? You know, on the outside, it looked perfect, but inside, everything I felt was crumbling. My relationships, I was so tired the whole time. And it was then that I decided that I needed to do something with my life that would be able to change the way that I thought and the way that I lived.
How do you know if you've got burnout? Because people say it all the time. It's sort of overused to some extent.
Yes.
Or potentially. How did you know, and how would another person know if they actually are suffering from burnout? Because some people are suffering and they just keep going.
Yeah, absolutely. And I felt like I was like that. So my health was becoming not great, you know, which ended up in me.
What do you mean? You were sick?
So I started getting like a lot of colds, and even to just like look at myself, like my skin looked bad, and it, you know, I've never had those kind of issues. I felt like I had permanent jet lag. And the worst bit was that when I would go to sleep, I couldn't sleep because my mind was just swirling with all the work and things that I had to do. And so it was like one day to the next, I just felt so depleted. And then it was this feeling of complete apathy where I didn't care about anything anymore. And it's interesting when you talk about emotions, they actually say that that emotion is kind of worse than being angry or, you know, sad, because then it's an actual emotion that you have this strong feeling towards. But apathy is like you stop caring, right? You stop caring, you stop enjoying. Like I remember everything became hard. Even my kids, who I love dearly, it became hard looking after them. Like nothing was fun, nothing was exciting to me anymore. I was so tired, and all I could think about was work 24/7. And that moment where I got a really bad case of the flu, this is the pre-COVID times, and I could barely walk to the couch. I remember, as I said, in that moment, just thinking, I can't do this anymore. It was a light bulb moment, but also one of the worst moments of my life where I thought, I just can't go on like this. I need to make a change in my life. And I did.
But did you look at it like, did you think to yourself, this is a failure? Did you, and if so, did you have to struggle with what is failure as opposed to am I being successful by actually recognizing it?
Yeah, that's right. That's a great question. I think at the time I probably did feel like it was some sort of failure because, as I mentioned, I always wanted to achieve that. I always wanted to be this, I wanted to do a lot of acting and things like that when I was young, but I wanted this show to work, and I wanted to be the best producer I could. And I thought that I had built something that would allow me to do that. And what I realized is that I was completely crumbling inside. So I 100% felt like I had failed. And yet at the same time, I also was still too scared to let go of that job.
Why?
Because I was scared to go into the unknown, and I was scared that I was at the best show that I could be on for radio at the time, and I wouldn't maybe get another job anywhere else. And it was very safe for me. You see, going into the unknown is scary for majority of people, and it's something at that time, and even now still, when I know all about the unknown and how a lot of potential comes from going into places that we fear. For me, that was scary. So you know what happened. This is quite a funny in hindsight story. I didn't want to leave that job, even though I hated it and I felt so unwell and all that kind of stuff. So when I had that dark night of the soul moment when I was very unwell, the decision that I made was I want to understand the mind-body connection. I want to understand why some people are happier than others. I had a friend that was doing a lot of personal development work. And so I went and dived into every personal development book, anything on psychology that I could study, because I wanted to understand how I could change the way that I was thinking. One thing about me, if I do something, I go all in, right? I don't just like read a book or listen to a podcast and sure, I understand it, but make no changes in my life. I'm that sort of person where I make a decision to do something, I'm going to do it. And I thought to myself, I need to change my behaviors and my habits because they have led me to this point of burnout. For example, I had a mind that was running wild, right? There's a beautiful Sufi poet from, the 19th century called Rumi, and he has this saying, which was my mind. It says, why do you put yourself in jail when the door is wide open? And that is talking about the mind, where the way that we are thinking is how we perceive things on the outside, right? We can change that in a second. And for me, I had grown up in a family who was so loving and beautiful, but they were worried about everything, right? So it was like, worried about me driving at nighttime, worried that I was too cold, worried that I was too hot, whatever it was. So I grew up with this understanding of worrying. So I would worry about everything. I would constantly worry about my job. I would worry about things that hadn't happened. Say, for example, I'd get an email from someone that I worked with that might have been more superior to me. And it would be like something like, I want to see you tomorrow to discuss a project we're working on. I wouldn't be able to sleep that night. And then I would drive to work thinking that I was probably going to get fired or some other negative thing, right? And this was all because an email said, I want to meet you tomorrow to discuss a project. So my mind was so wired, Mark, towards the negative rather than the positive. That was just my way of coping, but it was driving me mad and it was making me sick, right? Everything I would worry about, even the smallest things, right? Oh my God, my kids are going to this excursion today. Will they be okay? The worst case scenario always playing in my head. It was a safety mechanism. And then the more I studied the mind-body connection, the more I realized, hold on, the way that I think is my choice, not someone else's. I have the ability to change the way that I think. And we know now through neuroscience and neuroplasticity that the mind can rewire itself to the day that you die. You just need to know how to use it properly. So I started to learn about how do we do that? When we get negative thoughts, how do we get rid of them and replace them with a positive feeling thought? What happens when we're ruminating? How do we get out of the cycle of having this negative thought when it's 3:30 a.m. and not being able to sleep? And the more I studied that and the more I learnt about it and how to undo that, the more that I was free. And it wasn't free from any person. It was free from myself, right? And it was the most liberating thing that I've ever experienced. And so going back to the story about what happened is the only thing I was still scared of was moving out of that role, right? So I was holding on to dear life to a role, which sounds so crazy. Even now when I'm telling this story, I'm like, why would I have done that? That I did not like, but it was security for me. I was getting paid a lot of money. And then the boss came from Sydney to Melbourne and he said, your role is moving to Sydney. So do you want to move to Sydney? And I'm like, I can't move to Sydney. Like my whole family's in Melbourne and it's just not going to happen. And it was interesting because I'd been maybe 2 months or so on this studying the mind and learning about psychology and all these other different, bits and pieces.
Mindset stuff.
Exactly. And I would have normally have freaked in a situation like that. But for some reason, I felt okay. And I reckon it was 1.5, 2 weeks later when I got a call from Dave Cameron and Todders saying, hey, we're just started podcast 1 and Hamish and Andy are moving from radio into podcasting. Do you want to be their executive producer? And I was like, oh my God, of course I do. And like I said, 3 months into being their EP, I came up with the idea for my podcast because I could not believe these changes in my life that were happening when I started to change the way that I viewed the world and the way that I thought about myself.
You talked about neuroplasticity before, and that's obviously what you've done. You've gone and changed the way you think, and the brain can do that. But what's the step before it? Do you have to have a catastrophe around you, so much so that you're at the lowest point? You've just got nowhere to go except do something like this, or further demise, or do you get inspired by somebody else? And hopefully someone could be listening to this right now or read your book, which we'll talk about a little bit later, or listen to your podcast, might get inspired by you and make a change. How do most people decide that they're going to make that mindset change?
Yeah, that's a great question. So as you would know from your podcast, and I know from mine, I would say 95% of people that come on have some hardcore story, and it's a negative one that has made them look within to then make changes in their life. But your work and my work, we don't want people to get to that point, right? You can change yourself at any stage in your life by listening to a podcast or reading a book. But a lot of us won't change if we're comfortable. We change because we're uncomfortable and we don't want to go on like this. And some people don't change at all, and that can be detrimental to them because they can get into a point where they're in a really bad situation and they don't know how to get out of it, or they, are thinking really badly of themselves and they don't know how to rewire their mind or make any sort of changes in their life, and they lead the rest of their life not being very happy people.
How important is it for, say, like someone like you, and given that you now talk about this a lot, how important is it for us to have good community around us to help us sort of either recognize this issue or have someone to talk about this issue, even if it's only one person, or once we make the decision, have people to support us, like a husband, a wife, a friend, a brother, sister, mates, whatever the deal is.
Yeah. I think it's unbelievably important.
Did it help you?
It helped me immensely. I was really lucky, and I think about this a lot, that I had friends that were interested in the same things as me. So I had a friend in particular, as I mentioned, that was really getting into personal development work. So she said, why don't you read this book? There's another book that's great. So she was guiding me a little bit.
Because she thought you needed it, or because you reached out to her?
Yeah, I reached out to her because I knew she had started really getting into this stuff, and she seemed very happy as well. Right?
But how did you know you should do that? Because some people don't even know that.
I know. It's interesting.
Instinct?
It was instinct. I've always had an interest in personal development and never at all religion, but I really do understand and appreciate it. And so when I was 18, I studied the Kabbalah. I'm a Jewish person, and there was this very well-renowned, or still exists, rabbi in Melbourne, where I'm from, and he was teaching the Kabbalah, and it was the spiritual teachings of, the Jewish religion. And that really interested me for some weird, it seemed quite strange because no one else was into it except maybe Demi Moore and Madonna at the time.
Well, not bad company.
Yeah, exactly. And I remember studying with him and really enjoying it. And then it kind of lay dormant. I did that for a year or so, and I was young. I just finished school. And so I always had that interest in learning about things to do with the mind, things that were slightly esoterical. It just interested me. And so when I was at my darkest point and I saw that my friend had been doing some other work on herself, and I thought, you know what? I was thinking about this for a little bit of time, and now that I'm at a point where I really need help, this is what I'm going to do.
Did your friend, and does that deduction or that conclusion to do that, once you're experiencing what you're experiencing, does that come about as a result of having someone within your community where you have observed that person going through either something similar, or alternatively having made the decision to work on their personal self, and then observe that it looks like they're enjoying themselves a lot better. Is it? And
Yes.
therefore, how important is the whole community thing?
Yes.
Because if you
Some
hadn't,
people don't have
if you
them.
hadn't been if you hadn't been sort of open to this individual and didn't have a relationship with this individual, then you may not have never gone down this track.
Yeah. Look, I think 50% was seeing her working on herself and how well she was doing, and 50% was also me understanding that this personal development world existed and always having a slight fascination with it, because the Kabbalah stuff really talks to that as well. So I think it was both the social proof that she was doing well and I trust her.
Good sentence, social proof.
Yeah.
I like that.
And then also my own inkling that this was kind of an area that also interested me. And I think now, 7 years later, or no, it's more than that, for people that don't have community, they have podcasts, they have live shows, there's so many more books out there. It's become so mainstream, personal development, wellness. It's, when you sell a podcast, we were talking about that before we started, it is one of the top tiers of things that people are interested in. I think COVID.
Like crime and sex.
Yeah, exactly. Crime's always the first one. I think COVID really helped that too. People had time.
Build awareness.
Yes. People looked within and they realised that a lot of people suffered during that time, so it then really built out this understanding of what more can I do for myself and, how can I get my inside secure to make the noise of the world and what happens on the outside, which we don't have a lot of control of, how can I deal with that knowing that I've got a deep inner core that I've worked on?
So you launched before COVID. You launched your podcast before COVID, albeit sort of in a very modest way initially, I guess. But it sounds like you had some pretty big guests early up. But how much do you think that COVID has conditioned our minds or listeners' minds to be far more open and have something greater than a preparedness, like nearly like a penchant to find out more about mindset and wellness and mental wellness and having good balance? How important do you think COVID was for that?
I think huge.
Yeah.
I think huge, right? Because firstly, people were in crises because they were locked up, all good reason, right? We weren't,
especially down in Victoria.
Yeah, especially down where I was. People still talking about that now. And the fact that we talked about community and how important that is, we were taken away from that, right? You were lucky if you had a family or someone that you lived with, but otherwise, if you didn't, that was very hard. So what happens again, people go through crisis. And what happens when you go through crisis? Crisis is the touchstone of spiritual expansion of some sort. And, through that is personal development work. I can only control what I do. I can't control the outer world. So how do I make my inner world as strong as possible? And that's what happened during COVID. So I do think for sure everything from wellness to personal development to mindset boomed after that.
And do you think, it certainly is my case, but do you think that your podcast is a form of therapy for you?
Oh, absolutely. My podcast brings me so much joy because it's not like work. Firstly, I get to meet the most amazing people. I choose who I have on. So I'm not, it's not like producers are saying, they might give me ideas, sure, but no one's forcing me to have certain people on. And I think that makes such a difference in the quality of the conversations. I remember back in the radio days when I was producing, they had to have certain people on, right? You've got to do this for Channel 9, you've got to do this and that. There's none of that in podcasting. So, maybe some podcasts, but not ours. So I love that. And I have an interest in all different types of people. And I honestly love conversations like you. I love hearing about what makes someone tick. I love hearing about how they went through adversity and then climbed out of it. And I love listening as well. I honestly do. So when I have a conversation with a person, I just love hearing what they have to say and engaging with them in that. So it is absolutely a form of therapy. And It is, that podcast has done so much for me. It's funny because a lot of people, they have a brand and they create a name for themselves and then they do a podcast. Whilst I didn't have that because I was a producer and I had an idea and I also had been through my own stuff and I had, this knowledge of mindset and personal development. And I started the podcast like that. And then that podcast has turned into a book. I do live shows now, with thousands of people in the audience. I'm a keynote speaker. That podcast has been the door to open so many opportunities for me, and I love it still more than anything.
Do you think that maybe when you look back on it, those things, is that you were always meant to be a podcaster, which is sort of like a semi-performance. I think it is anyway in my case. And therefore you were probably always meant to be a performer of some type.
Well, it's funny you say that. Because,
as opposed to be on the other side of the camera.
Yeah. And when I was on the other side, I enjoyed it a lot. So I wasn't, some people that kind of go on the other side, but they always want to be in front. Yeah. I wasn't like that at all. But when I was young, I loved acting, right? So I was at a big drama school in Melbourne from 4 or 5 years of age. I did all the school plays. I went to uni and did, marketing and all these other things, but I also studied film when I was there. I absolutely loved that. But then a drama teacher said to me when I was at uni, so I would have been, around 18, 99% of actors are unemployed. If you think about doing this, you should think again. And I was shattered. But I also didn't want to do a job where I wasn't going to earn money and, have to waitress on the side. I didn't want to do that. So then I moved into corporate, like marketing. I did that at a bank. I did it at realestate.com and all these other places. And then it wasn't till maybe 10 years of working within that kind of very corporate sector that I got the job at Southern Cross Austereo. But you know what, Mark, and I talk about this often, and from a business perspective, I think you could relate to it. Doing the hard yards in corporate, which at times was not fun, and it was definitely not exactly what I wanted to do, gave me the most unbelievable skills, right?
What skills do you get from that?
So even things like being able to write an email properly, answering the email in an efficient amount of timing, understanding where you have bosses, just how to speak to them, what's expected. It's quite rigid in those places.
Can I just stop you there for a second? Because you glossed over something and you were being very modest about it. But it's an interesting point, being able to read an email and then being able to craft a response. Now, some people do get stuck because they overthink the response, and as a result of that, the response is late, and it's no better. But they might do 20 drafts. That's a skill, but to be able to hit it up in one draft, 2 drafts, small changes, but do it quickly and efficiently, but get back to the individual who's sent you the email.
Yes.
Because if you get 20 emails or 30 emails in a day, these just bank up.
Yeah.
And that's a new form of stress and anxiety. And look, shit, I haven't answered all the questions. I haven't answered all the emails. I can't get on top of this. It's getting too much for me. How did you learn that skill about how to be efficient around what is good enough as opposed to what's perfect?
So working at places like Census, realestate.com, like I worked at all of them, and they were, big corporates and they expected a lot from you. And I was junior going into these roles. And so basically I just was at the understanding that if someone emails you, you need to get back to them that day, right? And, I was always a good writer, so I knew how to put an email together. But I just became unbelievably efficient because I never wanted anyone to have to wait around for some email from me or whatever it was. So it just became practice. I'm sure the first couple of emails, the first year of emails wasn't as good as the year after that. And, I think I got in trouble here and there. I remember a lawyer at one of the places I worked, I got in trouble because I didn't put something within an email. So you learn, right? You learn when you make little mistakes along the way. And it's enough to kind of scare you a little bit to go, okay, I'm going to do better at this time. I'm going to make sure that I include whatever it is that they wanted. I might read over the email a couple of times to make sure all the spelling and grammar is good. I mean, these are way before AI days. And you just learn how to do that. I find now, and I was talking about it with a girlfriend the other day who also worked in corporate, it allows you to be unbelievably efficient. And these days, a lot of people, you might wait 3 weeks and get an email back.
Yeah.
And this is like an opportunity for them. And you're asking, quote me on something, or can you do this? And you're like, I don't, there was not even an acknowledgement like, hey, I've got your email.
Yeah.
I'm so snowed down at the moment. I'll send you something next week. Nothing. You're like, did I even have the right email address? There was no bounce back. Things have changed. And I think working in that corporate role, being unbelievably efficient, it being quite strict and rigid, which, I felt was boring at times. Then when I moved over to Southern Cross Austereo, I was like, this is the most relaxed place I've ever worked, right? But I was an amazing producer because I'd come from that very strict, rigid, things have to be done perfectly. And it ended up leading me to this point because of all the knowledge I got in those other roles. Especially I worked in PR for a period of time. I worked in marketing. So I can think like that when I have my podcast now. Okay, marketing, what will work, PR, what's going to work. So everything leads you to this point. So for anyone listening that might not have gotten their dream job straight away, I mean, I didn't get it. It took me years to get to where I wanted to. It's an evolution, but I learned so much from those roles that I didn't love.
So that's interesting. You talked about routine. So how important do you think working in the corporate environment actually taught you and actually enabled you to get a proper mindset as to how to structure your email answering process, let's call it that. It's not what all you did in the day, but how to structure that part of your day. In other words, every day at 9 a.m. or every day at 6 p.m. or every evening at 8 p.m. or every certain time, I'm going to go through my emails to make sure everything's been answered. That mindset of efficiency, because the only way you get efficiency is through structure, and structure is where it comes from the right mindset.
Yes.
And that goes back to what you were talking about, mindset for yourself relative to how you were suffering when you're doing the radio show, changing your mindset. But this is a learned skill.
Yes.
And I put it down to mindset. And mindset to me is about structure. How do I set my mind?
Absolutely. And I think when you have people around you, like I said, I was young. These were like the first jobs besides, doing bits and pieces when you're at uni. These were the first like proper corporate jobs that I had. Watching people who are above me and the way that they were behaved, they guide you. Human behavior. It was everything. I feel bad if I have left an email without a response for more than 2 days. I feel bad. Yet I see that behavior, not from other people, right? So it was so good in getting me to where I am. And it absolutely allowed me to have the mindset of, okay, this is how you work in a business, in a corporate business, in one that's very successful, in one where, they're dealing with other things that are very, very important. And this is the way I need to show up for that. So I learned a huge amount.
So just a quick observation from my point of view in relation to you. How important do you think, in your case, it has been for you to succeed through various ups and downs for you to have this one characteristic, that is the ability to be an observer? In other words, you observe your girlfriend who was going through some challenges and she changed her mindset. You observe the people in the corporate environments and watch which behaviors were successful, which weren't successful. How important, and by the way, podcasting is all about observation if you're the host, but how important do you think stepping back and just looking at what's going on around you, being a really good observer as opposed to a participant?
Yeah.
Because, some people just want to be the participant. They want to be in the front row, participating, involved. But sometimes that's important to be that, but sometimes you've got to be able to step back and be an observer. How important is that to you?
Oh, everything. And no one's ever asked me that question. I love it. Everything. You know how important.
Beauty, I got you. I got that question.
I was like, God, this is good. It made me a very good interviewer. And I'll tell you why. Because as a producer, I used to sit there, and this is when I was on radio, and they have like 6-minute breaks. I mean, just to think that we do podcasts that go for an hour or so and we get into the topics and it's, really thoughtful. You go on a radio show and God forbid you're trying to like promote a book or whatever it is. I mean, they ask you one question, they say the name of your book, they greet you and it's time to go.
It's very transactional.
It's so transactional. And it was interesting because I would think, why is the host cutting them off? They didn't even ask a good question. This person has so much to say and they haven't read the notes properly, because usually in radio it's the producer that's writing the questions not always, but a lot of the time. And I observed so much and I always would think they should have done this or maybe they could have done that. But also maybe that was really good and I loved the way they interacted with that person. And so again, not really realizing, I wasn't so conscious about it, but I was picking up so much knowledge by observing what these people were doing over however many years. And then working even on Hamish and Andy, they didn't really interview people on their on their podcast, but what I observed from them was how to be a good boss. Because the two of them—
From your point of view.
Yeah, yes. The two of them, they weren't even really my boss, to be honest with you, but they were just talent that we were working with. But the way that there was 10 of us, and the way they ran the show was unbelievable. It was efficient. You had a laugh every single day because they're so naturally funny. They were kind. They were generous. And you wanted to work hard for them, even though they didn't, tell you that or anything like that, because you adored them. And I remember thinking, because I'd had some crummy bosses over the years, as well as some really nice ones. And I remember thinking, when I build my team, that's how I want to be, because they are leading through kindness, and we were efficient for them, not fear. And it was so old school to lead through this fear kind of mindset. And if I scare the person, they're going to work harder for me. Because those boys, they've still got people on their team that have worked for them, I think, for like nearly 20 years. And it's a young team. So these people have worked with them since they were, just out of uni or whatever, because they love them. And so that, from an observation perspective, was life-changing for me as well.
Would you say to people, how would you say to people to get the right balance between being a participant, because you've got to be a participant too, and or being an observer? I mean, how do you work out when I should sit back and observe or when I should jump in and participate? Because some people are shy. They don't like to participate.
Yeah.
They like to observe. Some people around the other way, they've got no sense of awareness and all they want to do is participate all the time and don't want to step back and observe. But getting that balance, there's a bit of balance involved here, a lot of balance involved in here. You've learned it because you've had the opportunity to work with, all these various people, these great people you've worked with. But how would you say to an average person or a young person who might be listening to this now, might be thinking, I want to go and do a podcast. I want to either be a producer of a podcast or I want to become a podcaster. What would you say to those individuals about getting that balance right?
Look, I think observing, as we said, it's a great thing because that's where you learn from. And then if you have questions to ask through your observations, then absolutely ask them, because, if you're asking them to people who are wise or experienced, you're going to get great answers. But you don't need to be the loudest person in the room, right? I think a lot of people think that if I talk a lot, if I ask like a huge amount of questions, it seems like I have high self-esteem and that I'm really, very curious and into it. That's not true. The people that feel the best about themselves and have the most confidence are usually the ones that sit back and don't need to prove anything. But if there is something that you have a question about, then for sure, ask it. But do a kind of dance between the balance between both, because you're going to learn a lot by observing what's going on and then ask the question. And make sure you think about the question before you ask it.
So your book, first, your book is called Living a Life of Greatness, which is Steps to Fulfilling Existence. Your podcast is called the same.
A Life of Greatness.
A Life of Greatness.
Yeah.
What does that mean, a life of greatness? So maybe you can, because I'm sure it doesn't mean you're going to turn people into Donald Trump, or assuming he's great, or whoever else could be great in the world. What does that mean?
Yeah, so it's interesting because I asked this question at the end of my podcast to every single person, what is a life of greatness to you? And I think I've done 500 and something interviews. And you'll get similar answers from a lot of people. But I think a life of greatness is about doing work or living a life that has purpose and meaning in it, doing something that you love. And even if it's not an actual something to do with work, doing something in your spare time that fulfills you, allows you to want to wake up in the morning. And also having an element of that is of service. So everything you do helps people, right? Helps them in their own lives in so many different ways with all the avenues of the businesses and things you do. I mean, how much would it fulfill you when you get an email or you see someone in the street and they said, you know what, that podcast episode or the TV show or whatever it was, that changed my life. And I am now doing X, Y, and Z because of something you said. I mean, that you don't need any more than that to keep you going, right? So being able to do anything that has an element of service attached to it is going to make your life great. And, within my book, I realized there were certain pillars that I found in my life through my own work as a mindset coach, but also from interviewing people on a life of greatness, where I thought if people have these certain pillars, and that's the different chapters in the book, then they'll be able to lead a fulfilling and great life. But, showing up and doing things of service are always going to make you feel more enriched than doing something that's just for you.
And do you lean into your podcast stories or some of your podcast
some
guests
of them, yeah,
into your book?
Yeah, some of them I do. Yeah.
So you're taking some of those things, those
Yes.
experiences out that you've experienced and or the guests has experienced, and put them into the book. And who do you think your book, or who is the book sort of directed to, apart from just anyone who wants to read it? But did you have in mind, I want to share this with a certain cohort of people?
Yeah. Look, I think I thought it's for anyone that wants to better their life, right? Anyone that wants to work on themselves and they don't, as we said, have to go through a crisis or anything like that. Someone that just wants to have a life that is better than it is now. That was it. It wasn't just for females or just for males or for a certain age demographic. I wrote it in a way that I wanted to make it easy to understand for most people, and that they could pick it up and also have elements that they could relate to, right? So I think when I write, people say to me, I could relate to that story. I saw myself within something that you wrote about. They'll say that with the podcast as well. And we know when we relate to something, we go, oh, I'm not alone. Yeah. Sarah went through that too, or whoever my guest might be.
Well, they can't believe you went through it, but the fact that you said you went through it,
it gives them hope.
Yeah, and it's very, very interesting, Sarah, that you've done this, but and obviously your podcast as well. But what's interesting about this type of thing is that there's a lot of, when you write these books, as I've written a couple, it's requires a lot of honesty, and you have to dig deep, and you have to be honest with yourself and whoever buys the book, and that also makes you start to think about what courage is. How does courage fit into my life? And, so I'm going to say something, am I courageous enough to say that or admit that? Especially if you're admitting what would normally be considered not to be success or challenges. And because that's what people want to read about. They're not really interested about reading about your success.
No, it's true.
They want to relate to, I experienced that too. And she got over it, I can get over it. So sort of off the back of that, you get hope as well. So honesty, courage, hope. And they're the sort of things we don't talk about much these days. We want to talk about everything else, but we don't talk about virtues enough.
No, we don't.
And that probably brings me right back to the Kabbalah and or the Bible or any of those great scriptures that have been written. Even if you go back to, the stories by Homer, they're all about the same thing. They're sort of they endure every generation for thousands and thousands of years, and it could be in any text, could be Buddhism for that matter. Basic virtues.
It's all the same sentiment. Someone said this beautiful quote to me once. It was, "Don't take away someone's hope. It might be all that they have."
Yeah, wow.
And you write these stories to allow people to know that it's okay and that we all go through hard times. And I had this beautiful lady on the podcast one day, and she said this really profound line to me. She said, "No day of your life will ever come again." And it sounds so simple. No day of your life will ever come again. But the more you think about it, the more you're like, oh my God, that's so right. Why do I sweat the small stuff? You know, if any of us have come into a situation where health comes into question, or someone we love suffers something that scares us, you know, to do with their health or whatever it is, mortality, we realize that all the things we were worried about and all those little things, they don't matter, right? And knowing that, again, it allows you to change the way that you live your life, thinking, I'm not going to be worried about those things anymore. There are bigger things at play here, more important things, and not everything in life has to be, you know, with a silver bow around it and perfect. It's okay. It's okay to go through life and have hiccups and all of that along the way, but to show up as a good person, to serve other people and do the best that we can in something that we enjoy and love the people around us, that's the most important thing.
Some of the greatest gifts in life do not come in a Tiffany bag.
Yeah.
They're in some other form or some other fashion. And hopefully it's after listening to your fabulously successful podcast and now your really successful book. Thanks very much, Sarah.
Thank you so much for having me. I love this conversation a lot.
You're welcome.